Assistant Infrastructure Minister Jamie Briggs speaking there this morning. So the government's keen to get the focus on the infrastructure, but there's still a lot of talk about this debt levy. I'm joined now by Dr Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, and they've done their own research into the budget situation. Richard Dennis, good morning.
Good morning.
What do you think about the prospect of this debt levy?
I think it's a good idea. Nothing mentioned about it in the Commission of Audit, strangely enough, but look, Australia's got a revenue problem. By historic standards, we're just not collecting enough tax, and to put it into perspective, if John Howard tried to balance the books on today's level of revenue, he'd have been in deficit for 10 of his 12 years that he was in power. So we need to collect more revenue, and I think this is a fair and a good way of doing it.
Are there more effective long-term ways of doing this, though, than repairing the budget situation?
Oh, look, let me put it into perspective. In 2001, the top tax bracket kicked in at $60,000 in income. Today it's $180,000. In 2001, 13% of Australians were in the top tax bracket. Today it's 3%. So this is just moving us back a bit to rebalance where we used to be. And in terms of the long term, look, I think the levy should be permanent. I think the worst feature of it is to propose that it's short term. I mean, the Commission of Audit tells us we've got long-term structural problems. The government says we've got long-term structural problems. Why are they talking about a temporary increase in revenue?
So you think there should be a permanent debt levy?
I think there should be a permanent increase in the top tax bracket and a top tax rate. And they can call it a levy, they can call it a tax, they can call it whatever they want. What we're talking about here is Australia's got a shortage of revenue. This is an equitable and time-honoured way of collecting revenue. We should do it, but the idea that we only need it for a year or two, that's the crazy part.
So what should that rate be increased to?
Oh, look, I think the rate they're proposing makes sense. I think they should look at actually lowering the threshold at which it kicks in. Again, in 2001, someone earning $60,000 a year was deemed to be in the top tax bracket. That's blown out by 300%. So we talk about bracket creep. We talk about the idea that a small number of people wind up in the top tax bracket. Well, the number of people in the top tax bracket's fallen from 13% of taxpayers to 3%. So I think the rates are about right, but probably the threshold should be a bit lower.
So what should that threshold be decreased to?
Oh, look, I think anywhere back to $150,000 would be a great start. But again, it needs to be permanent. I mean, this is the problem the government's created for itself. It's told everyone that we've got these long-term problems, yet now it's proposing a short-term solution.
Well, it sounds like they could be moving on family tax benefits as well. What do you think about that?
Look, I think there's room for change there. I think not many Australians could explain the difference between family tax benefit A and B. Not many people could explain I mean, they're basically both designed with a different rationale. So I've got no problem with governments reviewing programs over time, but what they need to do is be quite clear about why they're doing it. Now, if what we're trying to do is clean up the system, make it fairer, make it simpler, I'm 100% supportive of that. But trying to pretend that we can't afford to provide support to low-income earners when we're about to introduce a generous paid parental leave scheme for high-income earners, trying to say we have to cut pensions over time while we continue to hand out massive tax concessions to superannuation for high-income earners, that's what's both bad policy and I think bad politics.
Won't it be very politically dangerous for Tony Abbott to go down this path of a debt levy? Even the right-wing commentators are saying this would clearly be a broken promise, and that's what he's staked his reputation on.
Absolutely, but it's still a good idea. You know, the fact that the Prime Minister Abbott made such a fuss about Julia Gillard changing her mind is probably going to be a problem for him as Prime Minister. But the reason Prime Ministers change their mind is because the circumstances change. You know, we've got to get past this idea. I mean, you know, why Wayne Swan ever gave an ironclad guarantee about what the deficit would or wouldn't be, no one knows what the future looks like. Now, this government made a lot of promises pre-election. They want to get rid of the carbon tax, they want to get rid of the mining tax, and they wanted an expensive paid parental leave scheme. In opposition, it doesn't matter if your numbers don't add up. In government, it does. Well, their numbers don't add up. They're going to have to break some promises, and I'd rather they break a promise about revenue.
So even if they do break this promise, you think the electorate should go easy on them?
Well, it's up to the electorate to make their decisions about what they think is most important, but the Prime Minister made promises before the election that are unsustainable. You can't do it all. You know, what the budget papers do once a year is spell out how much revenue you're collecting and how much you're spending. And they're not going to be able to deliver their spending promises if they don't do something about revenue. So they will be breaking a promise. The question is which one.
Do you think that the political courage will be there to make some of the decisions you're talking about? Like, do you think we could see a surprise in terms of like lowering the top tax bracket?
Well, if they don't, they're not going to raise much revenue. I mean, if all they do is introduce a small increase in tax for a very small number of people, they're just not going to collect much revenue. So I think they do have to look at lowering the threshold. And look, I actually think Labor and the Greens should support that. I mean, Labor and the Greens want to spend money on services. Well, here's a government offering to go and collect some revenue. Sure, score the political point, say he lied before the election, but that doesn't affect the reality that we're about to pass legislation for a budget. This Prime Minister's offering to collect more revenue from the highest income people. Surely Labor and the Greens would support that.
The Greens are suggesting this morning that the government should, and they've been suggesting this for a while, the government should look at the mining tax. Is that a legitimate way for the government to raise money as far as you're concerned?
Absolutely, but they're not mutually exclusive. You know, why would the Greens sit back and say, I won't support an increase in income on high income earners until you do something about the mining tax? Now, as an economist, I think we should do both. But as parliamentarians, they have to vote on the legislation that's in front of them. And I just can't see why you'd oppose an increase in tax. Again, I think it needs to be permanent. The Greens should perhaps just amend it to say, well, we'll vote for it if you'll make it permanent.
Okay, well, there's going to be a lot more talk about the budget over the next 4 or 5 days. Richard Dennis, thanks for coming in and talking to us.
Thank you.